Last week I went to the thrift store and bought a whole bunch of ceramic plates and bowls, and then I had a mini rage room session in my backyard, which was super satisfying. But the real reason why I did this was because I wanted to try making mosaics from the broken pieces. So the first thing I did is I separated them all into different colors, and then we made mosaic coasters. This was a great test just to see how the technique works, and it was so much fun I figured I'd show you how to do it. We used 4x4 pieces of wood here. I painted the back white and the sides. And then to prep the surface, I took an X-Acto knife and just scored the top in a checkered pattern. What this does is it just makes the surface a little bit more rough to help the pieces stick with the glue. And then speaking of glue, take a little bit of craft glue with some water, and with the watered down glue, you can seal the top of the wood before adding your pieces. So I'm gonna let that one dry and use the one I already prepped. Having them separated into different color-coded buckets was super helpful. I picked out the different pieces, a couple of each color that I wanted to use, and then you can take the chunks and try to arrange them on your square. Now, even though I did break these up, I thought pretty small, notice how some of these chunks are still pretty big and they're hanging off the edge. This made it really hard to get them to fit. I had tile nippers. There are special tools where you can shape them, but you know what I found even easier was just take a Ziploc bag and stick your big chunks in them so you can smash them up with a hammer. In fact, looking back, I wish I had done this with each of my plates that would have fit in a bag. That way the pieces would have stayed organized. But that's okay, now we know. It's easier to smash them on the floor, by the way. I put them on the floor of my studio, and I'm just taking the hammer, smashing the bigger bits into even tinier bits. So now you'll notice they're going to fit much easier on your coaster, and you can pick more colors this way. Now try to fit them on almost like a puzzle. They're not going to fit exactly like a puzzle. That's part of the charm of this technique. You have to work with the imperfections. But I tried to line up the pieces that fit along the edges and then fill in between. I even used a pair of tweezers to help get in some of the really tiny pieces just to fit. So something like this. Now notice I kept my safety gloves on the entire time. That's because these pieces are still pretty sharp, and they're not as bad as I thought they would be, but I would wear safety gloves through this process, and you can even take a piece of sandpaper. This is what I learned. Take the sandpaper, and especially along the sharp edges where the glaze is, if you can get that down, there's going to be less chance of any cuts or injuries as you're gluing and grouting. So now that I have all my edges smoothed out with the sandpaper, I'm going to start the gluing process. I'm using my E6000, but I know there's special glues made just for this type of mosaic. So if you do this kind of mosaic all the time and consider yourself more of a pro, feel free to give suggestions because I am in no way a pro. I'm just showing you what I learned this past week. With this glue, it doesn't dry right away, so I had some wiggle room on as I went. I could move the pieces around as needed. And they did shift a little bit. Your design may shift slightly as you go. Either way, once they're dry, you want to make sure to let it dry for at least 24 hours. And here's mine the next day. They're nice and tight. They're not falling off, which is good. And we're going to do the grouting next. Now, I used sanded grout on my other one. From what I understand, sanded grout is the kind you can use with really big gaps in mosaics. And we do have some pretty big gaps in there, although we tried. I'm using a plastic cup and a popsicle stick with some safety gloves, again, to keep my hands clean. And I'm mixing it to a peanut butter consistency. This was about 3 tablespoons of grout to 1 tablespoon water. But really, you kind of have to play with it. And then you ice it like a little piece of cake or butter it like bread. You don't want to cover the tiles. Try to scrape off as much of the grout as possible from the tiles so you don't lose them, but force the grout into all the gaps in between. Another thing about this type of mosaic is you have to work with the imperfections in the heights. They're all going to vary slightly on their different heights because they're different plate thicknesses. But I think that's what gives it a little bit of charm too. So notice I'm also working the grout into the holes along the edge and building it up so it's flat. That's why I said it's almost like icing a cake. You're filling it in and making it nice and smooth. So it should look something like this. And it still looks pretty messy, doesn't it? So to clean it up, you can take a damp sponge here Not wet. You don't want a lot of water getting into the grout, just enough to clean off all the excess grout from the tiles. This is also a chance to uncover any of the teeny tiny tiles that might have gotten covered as you were grouting. So, doesn't that look so much cleaner? Get it to look something like this. And notice that the tiles look clean, but they have a haze on them. What I like to do then is go in with a Q-tip. You can wet it a little bit if you need to. And this is the super satisfying part. You can clean off each individual tile and make sure you have all the edges showing. You're not going to be able to clean them completely, but this should get the majority of it off so you can let it dry overnight. Now the next day you can do a final cleaning once the grout is dry and really shine and buff those tiles, but look how shiny they are already. Now I have a set of matching coasters. I've heard there's also grout sealer, so that's something else you could do to make sure the grout stays in place. But there they are, and look, they hold my coffee. Perfect first try for broken china mosaics. If you have any tips or tricks, or if I missed anything, let me know in the comments because I'd love to do something bigger like a birdhouse next. We'll see.